This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello and welcome to this week's episode, where my guest is professional addiction recovery coach Andy Mitchell. Andy has conducted research into gardening as a tool to help people overcome addictions, and alongside having lived experience, Andy has extensive professional training within the field of addiction. We speak about why gardening provides such a powerful backdrop to the recovery journey and find out there's so much more yet to be learnt. Thank you very much to Andy for sharing his wealth of knowledge, and thank you for listening.
The work that I do now, I'm what's known as an addiction therapist stroke addiction recovery coach. But for the purposes of this podcast, it's the journey that's led me to where I am now. That's going to be particularly interesting. And my relationship, I suppose, with gardening and addiction recovery. In my previous life, in my previous world, I was working very much in IT. It was what I would consider a very tedious and mundane job. And as with many of us, there was, I suppose, a very significant life crisis that I had with my father having cancer and dying very rapidly. And I had a bit of a breakdown, not a bit, it was a major existential breakdown, I suppose you can call it. And what I also noticed was that I was very much self-medicating myself with alcohol at the time. I had a history, I suppose, of problematic use with alcohol, probably for most of my adult life. And I was in my early 40s then. And I thought I needed to do something to be able to help me to get out of this particular moment in time, help myself to get out. So I started looking for volunteer opportunities. And I came across a little ad online for St Mungo's Putting Down Roots, a homeless person's charity, and their gardening project. I've always had an interest in gardening. I must admit I'm more into edibles, but as far as growing, I seem to get a lot of satisfaction out of that. And I've had an allotment for over 30 years, plus I've got a small home garden. So I thought, oh, well, that seems like a really good opportunity. So I found myself being interviewed for this role as a volunteer for Putting Down Roots in this most beautiful, beautiful garden, slightly messy. Well, messy, let's say interesting, eclectic, but with a pond, lots of different areas. We had an allotment area, had ornamental garden area, had the most amazing compost area. And I found myself becoming really totally absorbed, not only into the space, but also into the individuals that were participating in the garden. So it wasn't just for people that were homeless, but there were also others attending from mental health services and addiction services from the local area, either via the NHS or through recommendation from their key workers, etc. So it was quite a mixed bag of individuals coming to this group. And one morning, I had quite a profound. It was sort of, so I was a volunteer to sort of help within the garden, and I was gardening with one lady. And she just turned around to me and said, you know, we have these profound moments of revelation. And she just turned around to me and said, you've got to sort yourself out. And I was having the shakes, and I was obviously had been drinking the night before. And it just suddenly realized that it was recovery, I suppose. I'd never given a name to what I was doing at that point in time. And really what I was doing is I was in the middle or somewhere within my own recovery journey. And by being able to give it a name, I suppose, I was able to then start to have very different conversations about my own needs and my own journey, I suppose, and to have a little look deeper into where I was with myself. And what I started to realize was that pretty much everybody there at that garden, whilst not in relationship to addiction in any sense, but with other sort of mental or physical health problems, were there purposefully using the garden and using gardening for their recoveries. And I just found this completely fascinating. And the idea that addiction recovery in particular can take many, many different shapes and forms, and interventions can take many different shapes and forms, was quite a revelation for me and quite pleasing. It was enlightening, let's just put it like that, because you always imagine, people sitting in groups and sort of sticking their hands up and going like, hi, I'm blah, 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 and, I'm an addict. And the fact that there are other forms of bringing people together in a purposeful activities, especially within the garden and the outdoor environment, was truly enlightening, I think. I think that's what I can say. And it made me hungry for information. And this is where I suppose I come into the social and therapeutic horticultural aspect. Being a slightly obsessive person by nature, it wasn't just good enough to discover that it seems to be working with people or for people this is the gardening interventions in addiction recovery. But what I wanted to know is why. I was just thinking, what's going on here? And very much as part of my own recovery journey, I decided that I wanted to learn about this process. It wasn't just good enough participating within it. And after a few years of volunteering, I became a paid member of staff, and I discovered that there was actually opportunities out there via an organisation. I know you interviewed Damien Newman recently from Thrive, to learn more about social and therapeutic horticulture, which was a whole new concept for me, bringing therapy and the social and the gardening, the horticulture together. Just seemed like such a fantastic idea to me. And then I saw that there was at Coventry University, they've stopped it now, unfortunately, but you could actually do a master's within the field of social and therapeutic horticulture, which is actually under occupational therapy. So we're actually deemed as occupational therapists, but specializing in social and therapeutic horticulture. And I decided as part of my master's there to really just focus on addiction recovery, simply because I couldn't really find that much information about what was going on there for this particular group of individuals. And I must say I've learned a hell of a lot. There still isn't very much information out there as such about bringing these topics together, but the ideas for me were quite revolutionary. And there's a new conceptual revolution happening about what is addiction and what is recovery and what does recovery mean. And this idea that people in active addiction have some sort of moral failing, I suppose, or are somehow lacking willpower, all these sort of negative things that we hear about people that are in active addiction. I just became aware that that just simply is not true. There's a layer of stigma there and self-stigmatization then that people often in addiction have to face, which is just another barrier to recovery. And through reading some of the work and through my own experience of working in the gardens with individuals, I saw that there's certain needs, I suppose, that we all have as individuals that maybe addiction had, I say, superseded. I don't know what term we could use, but I was very influenced by Johann Hari's TED talk about the opposite of addiction is connection. And in particular, how within occupational therapy, what we could do is we could actually view addiction in itself as an occupation, as something that we do. And thinking about it, addiction often, even though it has negative impacts, does give meaning and purpose to people's lives. It does give social connections. Interestingly enough, it also adds temporal structure. So it's something to do with one's time as well, not being with oneself. And I think what we see within the gardening is a community where that is understood, but also the garden is able, both metaphorically and physically, to enable a form of recovery which is almost organic. So I'm going to use loads of metaphors now in nature. And it has so much to offer.
Sometimes people think gardening is a panacea, and maybe if you're standing in a garden and you think, actually, I've slipped backwards, or, I'm using whatever it is, alcohol as a coping mechanism again, and yet I'm in a garden. Why is this not working for me? Why am I not happy? Is that because that gardening isn't, the kind of the only thing that helps, or is it because recovery is an ongoing journey?
Yeah, I think the core, or one of the cores there is we've got to ask what people are gaining from their addiction. And one of the ways of thinking about addiction and therefore recovery is about looking at individual people's needs. And one of the most difficult areas in the process of addiction recovery is, especially if people have been self-medicating with psychoactive substances, is that they have to start to learn how to be with themselves again through life's ups and downs. Within the garden, what we start to notice is, especially because most of the community, gardening communities, they're not specifically for people that are in addiction recovery. So we're bringing together lots and lots of different people from different areas of the community, or with different expectations of what the gardening can bring. And there seems to be an opening up of a conversation within the garden that is in itself a natural process. So we're not sitting there and specifically asking people about their specific challenges, but the conversation that happens is almost like a sort of natural process. And this starts right from the way the day is structured. So within the garden, what we have is we have a board, we have a shed, we have all the usual things within the garden. And on that board is a little sort of to-do list, what needs to be done. It could be, clearing paths. It could be a little bit of weeding bed, or a bit of pruning, bit of this and bit of that. People walk up and they choose their job, maybe get together with a few people. And this is all a major, major step for many of the people that attend the gardens, because what they're seeing is, although they're being given, again, a sense of responsibility, not just for themselves, but for others within the garden and the garden itself. And then we've got another layer of responsibility as well, and meaning, I suppose. So we have members of staff, we have visitors that sit on benches that are enjoying their lunches. They're utilising the garden for their own leisure periods and their work periods. So the idea of having a recovery intervention based on a meaningful and purposeful activity in which you can see results in the physical world, and also whilst at the same time you're interacting with others, seems to make a huge difference. And there's a sense of empowerment that comes with that. I think the way that we notice it the most is how people self-identify within the garden. Generally speaking, when people come for their first few sessions, they're generally quite shy, and the atmosphere of the others within this safe space, this safe green space, very rapidly transforms the individual from this more sort of passive user, service user identity, which they might have been used to being in before, to being an active member of a community with a role and a function, doing something that is purposeful. And we see that development in how people start to interact with each other, but also how people start to move away from this more sort of service user, passive service user identity into becoming a volunteer. So already people start to take an ownership of the space, an ownership of their own role within that, and a responsibility to the others that are all involved, whether that be people using the gardens and or other participants that they're gardening with.
So when I started gardening, I've said it many times before, it really was my salvation. And alcohol certainly played a part in me leaving my previous job, and changing my circumstances and everything. That said, though, alcohol's always been my coping mechanism. And I think that in the gardening industry, we have this tendency to think once you've discovered gardening, everything's fine, you've found yourself. And for many people, that is the case. But if you find yourself at 10 in the morning with a bottle of wine in your hand, looking out at a beautiful garden, going, I've got all of this around me, and yet here I am again. Is it because recovery is a journey? And also, you mentioned there the sort of social element and that camaraderie, I suppose, and that community element of the gardening. Is it different if you're on your own, or if you're maybe a lone worker, or you don't have that social connections, if it's just you and the garden?
So what we're talking about here is we're talking about intentional interventions. So there's a big difference between private gardening and going out maybe into a community gardening and gardening purposefully with others. There's a variety of different reasons why people might choose to do that, especially within the mental health world. So that could be with anxiety, depression, trauma, but also addiction. So the big difference, I think, with that, I suppose what you were suggesting there, just going out and gardening on your own, or going into a social and therapeutic community, social and therapeutic horticultural community, is actually the intention. This is why you're doing it. We might not quite fully understand why all the processes yet, and that's still a world that we'll discover as we do more research and we do more talking to the individuals that are actually participating. But there is an understanding that the reason why I am attending, if I'm a volunteer gardener within the community, is for my well-being. And the tool that we're using is the gardening with others. So in the forefront of the individual's mind, and us as social and therapeutic horticultural therapists, we're very, very aware of that. And the garden, I suppose, offers an alternative space in which people can start to rediscover skills that they might have either neglected or had maybe forgotten that they had as a result of their relationships with their substances, and to be able to build up a level of confidence within the real world. When I say real world, what we know about addiction, especially in relationship to psychoactive substances, is we often use as a coping mechanism, as you've just mentioned there. And addiction recovery is so much more than just abstinence. What it's about is it's about being able to thrive and to live life as full as possible without having to feel the need to go back into that world that is addiction. And that process of change, of reintroducing oneself, I suppose, to the sober reality can be incredibly traumatic for some people, especially if they've been using for decades. So the garden offers a gentle, kind space, and it's almost the opposite of addiction in that sense, where many use and it becomes very isolating. And when I say the garden is a gentle space, it's an open space. It's a space that has very little risk, intentional risk involved to individuals, but it also might be some of the first times that certain people have actually come out of their addictive environment, whether that be their home or hostel or wherever, and felt a sense of security in an environment that doesn't feel hostile. That step in itself is massive.
I'm glad you made that distinction, because, there will be people listening thinking, I'm gardening, therefore why am I not happy, or why am I not getting on top of things? But it is that actively seeking help first, and then gardening within a structured environment that is geared towards recovery. It's obviously very, very important, and I'm so pleased that you're doing this work, because you are doing groundbreaking work, actually. And as you said, then more needs to be researched in this area. If people wanted to find out more, how could they get in touch with you, or are there any resources that you might recommend?
It's pretty tricky at the moment, especially in relationship to addiction itself. I'm in contact with various different organisations. What I would say, if anybody is contemplating using gardening within their recoveries, I would actually approach any of the community gardens within, especially if you're within the UK. And you don't necessarily, and this is one of the delightful things about the gardening communities that are out there, you don't actually necessarily have to declare why you want to attend, because what you're actually doing is you're also becoming a volunteer. I think the majority of the community gardens will have the time and the space for you. I went recently, so I continue to visit gardens all over, well, whenever I'm away as well, abroad, but also here in the UK. Last weekend, I went to Chiswick House to their kitchen garden, and I was walking around while there were volunteers. You see already difference between service user and volunteer, and sort of listening in a little bit to the conversations that they were having. And the fact that you are attending these spaces and these gardens purposefully for your own recovery does not necessarily mean that it's a recovery based organization or an addiction recovery based organization. And I think that's probably one of the strengths there about why and how these spaces work.
So you don't necessarily, I suppose, need to have entered a formal program, just that, that's your intention, is that you're going along. And yeah, absolutely. We find that a lot too where I work.
Mm.
So yeah, that's definitely beneficial. You don't have to explicitly say why you're attending. Absolutely.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of scope for organizations to maybe open up or have specific programs for people within addiction recovery, but I'm not aware of very many at the moment. I know that you work for an organization which is for veterans, and I quite imagine that part of the trauma or part of the coping mechanisms that people have within that group, they're also having their journey, I suppose, within addiction recovery. Within the homeless person sector, we have a lot of people that are veterans that are also become homeless, that are also having issues with addiction. And it's really, really interesting how people find us, I suppose, or find the gardens, and publicizing them or getting more opportunities in which people can engage and enjoy, I think is really important. But I think it's important as well to point out that gardening isn't a standalone intervention for people in addiction recovery. Other services should be involved here, or as much as you possibly can, so this isn't a panacea that like, oh, go gardening and that's it, all your problems will be solved. But it's certainly a way in which people are able to enjoy their recovery. And I think that emphasis of having fun within recovery sometimes is missing within the more sort of formal interventions. And gardening can be fun.
Instead of recommending episodes this week, I wanted to say, if you're listening to this episode and you're struggling in any way, please reach out to someone. There are lots of people who will listen. If you're in the UK, the Samaritans are on 116123, and they're there if you're feeling distress or despair, or you're having thoughts of suicide. Or call NHS 111 or 999 if you think there's a serious risk to life. You can also text the word SHOUT to 85258, and they'll text you back if you need help. If you work in horticulture, you can call the Perennial Helpline on 0800 093 3843, and they can help with all kinds of things, including illness, injury, family matters and financial issues. If you're a veteran, or the family member of or carer for a veteran, you can of course contact the charity I work for, Veterans Growth, by emailing hello@veteransgrowth.org. You can also call the Forces Helpline on 0800 731 4880. Or reach out to a friend or relative, or message me on social media. Please don't feel you're alone. There's always somebody willing to listen and to help. You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.